Some songs arrive like deliberate craftsmanship, built note by note, word by word, across long afternoons and argued revisions. And then there are the other kind, the ones that don't arrive at all, the ones that simply appear as if they had always existed somewhere just beyond the edge of waking, waiting for the right mind to be still enough to receive them. John Lennon knew both kinds, but the second kind was the one that haunted him, the one he could never fully explain even to himself. And on one particular night, a night that began like any other, in silence and exhaustion, the most improbable thing happened. A melody came to him in a dream. What he did with it, and what it eventually became, would say more about who he truly was than almost anything he had ever deliberately tried to create. But the real story was never only in the music. To understand what that night meant, you have to go back further. You have to go back to Liverpool. Back to a boy who learned early that the world was not a gentle place, and that sound, pure, unfiltered sound, was the only thing that made sense of it. John Winston Lennon was born on October 9, 1940, in the middle of a German air raid over the city of Liverpool. The bombs were falling when he came into the world, which, depending on how you look at it, was either a terrible omen or a fitting beginning for someone who would spend his entire life existing in contradiction. He arrived into chaos and somehow made it musical. His childhood was not built on stability. His father, a merchant seaman named Alfred, was largely absent. His mother, Julia, was warm and spontaneous and deeply unsuited for conventional domestic life. When John was 5, his parents separated and he was sent to live with his Aunt Mimi, Julia's older sister, in a semi-detached house in Woolton. The house was called Mendip's. It was orderly. It was quiet. It was nothing like the boy who lived inside it. Aunt Mimi was not cruel. She was disciplined, clear-eyed, and genuinely devoted to John in her way, but she did not understand him, not really. When he began spending long hours listening to records, tapping rhythms on any surface he could find, filling margins of school notebooks with drawings and invented words and fragments of verse, she watched with a particular kind of cautious concern. She worried that music was leading him away from something useful. What she did not see, what no one around him seemed to see clearly yet, was that music was not a distraction from who John was. It was who John was. Every other version of himself was the performance. His mother, Julia, taught him to play the banjo. She played herself loosely and joyfully, the way some people laugh, not for an audience, but because the feeling demanded an outlet. When John was around her, he became a different kind of person, looser, lighter, more willing to be surprised by himself. Those visits to Julia's house across the city were, in retrospect, the early architecture of everything that would follow. She taught him that music was allowed to be fun, that it didn't have to justify itself, that a song could exist simply because it needed to. And then in 1958, Julia was struck and killed by a car driven by an off-duty police officer near her home. She was crossing the road. John was 17. The grief he carried after that night would never fully leave him. It would surface years later in lyrics that critics would call confessional, words that seemed to come from somewhere more honest than most people allowed themselves to go in public. But in the immediate aftermath, the 17-year-old boy from Liverpool did what he had always done. He picked up a guitar. He played. He didn't talk about it. He played. What happened in the years that followed is the part of the story that most people know, at least in its broad outline. The Quarrymen became the Beatles. 4 young men from a northern English city rewrote the rules of popular music with a velocity and totality that had no real precedent. By the mid-1960s, John Lennon was not simply famous. He was something closer to a cultural weather system, something that changed the atmosphere of wherever it moved. But fame for John was always a complicated thing, not because he was ungrateful and not because he was incapable of enjoying it. He was capable of enjoying almost anything when he chose to. But fame came with a particular pressure that he had never anticipated and for which nothing in his Liverpool upbringing had prepared him. Fame meant being seen constantly and never truly known. There is a difference, and John felt it keenly. The version of himself that appeared on television, in photographs, in press conferences, in screaming arenas, that version was sharp and funny and quick, always ready with a line that would be quoted the next morning. He was brilliant at being John Lennon, the public figure. What no one could see unless they looked very carefully was how often the brilliance was a way of keeping people at a precise and manageable distance. What the audience heard was a message. What he carried was something far less resolved. By the late 1960s, the Beatles were unraveling. The pressures that had built up across a decade of unrelenting work, internal disagreements, artistic divergence, and the sheer accumulated weight of being the most scrutinized band in the history of recorded music, it was all pulling at the seams. John was changing. Not declining but deepening, in ways that sometimes made collaboration more difficult and personal expression more urgent. He had met Yoko Ono in 1966 at a gallery exhibition in London. Their relationship was, from the beginning, entirely unlike anything he had experienced before. Yoko was an artist, a conceptualist, a woman who engaged with ideas on a level that matched, and sometimes challenged, his own restless intelligence. She did not see him as a Beatle first. She saw him as a mind, and for John Lennon that was an extraordinary thing to be offered. The world largely did not respond warmly to Yoko. The hostility was often cruel and frequently laced with a racism that John recognized and refused to accept quietly. He stood beside her in a way that cost him something publicly: old alliances, old affections, the comfort of being universally adored. He didn't particularly care. That willingness to absorb disapproval for the sake of something he believed in was, perhaps, one of the most genuinely courageous things about him. When the Beatles officially dissolved in 1970, it was both an ending and, in its own painful way, a beginning. John walked forward into solo work carrying everything he had learned about melody, about arrangement, about the particular kind of trust required to say something true in a song and then release it into the world without controlling what people did with it. And this is where the night in question arrives. It was 1971. John and Yoko were living at Tittenhurst Park, a Georgian estate in Berkshire, England. The house had a recording studio built into the grounds, a white room that John had designed to feel almost weightless, stripped of anything that might pull the mind toward the ordinary. He worked there in long sessions that often stretched into early morning, that strange hour when the mind becomes slightly permeable to things it normally keeps out. He had been working on what would become the Imagine album, a collection of songs that, in retrospect, represented both the height of his lyrical idealism and a more honest reckoning with his own contradictions than he had ever attempted before. The title track was already written. It had come relatively quickly, as his most direct songs often did, as if clarity required less time than complication. But there was another melody that had been circling him for days. He could feel its shape without being able to quite grasp it. This happened sometimes, a musical idea that existed just past the edge of articulation, close enough to sense but not yet solid enough to hold. He had learned over years not to chase these things too forcefully. Forced songs were never the same as received ones, so he waited. One night, after a long session that had yielded nothing he wanted to keep, he went to sleep, and then the melody arrived. It came in the dream fully formed, not as fragments to be assembled, but as a complete thing, beginning and arc and resolution. He heard it in the dream with a vividness that was different. From ordinary dreaming, it had texture, it had emotional weight, it had that specific quality that certain melodies have of sounding on first hearing as if they have always existed and you have simply been too distracted to notice them until now. He woke up, the room was dark, the house was silent. Beside him, Yoko was asleep. He lay still for a moment, holding the melody in his mind with the careful deliberateness of someone carrying water in open hands, knowing that the slightest wrong movement would lose it. He reached for the small tape recorder he kept beside the bed for exactly this kind of emergency. It was a habit he had developed years earlier, after losing too many ideas to the merciless efficiency of ordinary forgetting. He pressed record and hummed the melody into the machine in the dark, barely a whisper, just enough to capture the shape of it. Then he lay back down. In the morning, when he played back the recording, he felt something he would later describe only indirectly in interviews, a kind of recognition that went deeper than simple satisfaction. It was not the pride of having created something. It was the stranger feeling of having received something. As if the melody had not originated in him at all, but had passed through him, using the particular instrument of his unconscious mind the way a wind uses a set of chimes. He went to the piano. What followed was one of those rare creative sessions that musicians speak about with a certain reverence and a certain unease, the kind of work that doesn't feel like work at all because the usual resistance is gone. The melody opened outward as he played it. It suggested chord structures. It suggested a tempo, a breath, a pace, and eventually, sitting at the white piano in that white room in the early English morning, it began to suggest words. Not all the words came that morning. Some came later in fragments in the margins of notebooks and on the backs of receipts and in the middle of conversations about entirely different things. But the core of it, the emotional center, the thing the song was actually about, that was present from the first hour. It was a song about the distance between who we are and who we are capable of becoming, about the gap between the world as it exists and the world as we might, if we were braver, imagine it into being. The word imagine was already embedded in his vocabulary by then. Yoko had used it in her art, in her conceptual work, as an invitation and a challenge. But in the context of this melody, the word transformed. It became less a command than a question, not imagine this as instruction, but imagine this as possibility, as an open door rather than a directive. He was not naive. He knew the song could be read as simplistic, as politically utopian in ways that were easy to dismiss. He had already heard that criticism applied to his piecework, to the bed-ins, to the posters and the anthems. What he believed and what the music, at its best, actually communicated was more complicated than his detractors allowed. He was not saying the world was simple. He was saying the imagination was a form of courage, that to picture something different, clearly and without apology, was itself a political act. But the song existed before the argument. The melody had arrived before any of that, wordless and complete in the middle of the night. And that, for John, was the thing that mattered most. The song had not been engineered, it had been received. There is something in the history of music that resists easy explanation, the phenomenon of the fully formed idea that arrives unbidden, that seems to come from somewhere outside the deliberate mind. Paul McCartney famously woke from a dream with the melody to Yesterday already playing in his head, so complete that he spent weeks asking people if they had heard it before, certain he must have absorbed it from somewhere else. Keith Richards recorded the opening riff to satisfaction on a bedside tape machine in the middle of the night. The list goes on, across cultures, across centuries, across every conceivable style and genre. John Lennon was not unfamiliar with this experience. But the melody that arrived on that particular night in 1971 carried a different quality than anything that had come to him before. It was not just a melody. It was a kind of summing up, a distillation of everything he had been reaching toward, in music and in language, and in the public positions he had taken at considerable personal cost. When Imagine was released in October of 1971, the critical response was mixed in the ways that honest work often provokes mixed responses. Some heard in it exactly what he had intended, a song that held idealism and realism in the same breath, that managed to be political without being didactic, personal without being indulgent. Others found it too soft, too gentle, insufficiently confrontational for the moment. What no one could dispute was how it felt. There was something in the combination of that melody, the one that had arrived in the dark, in a dream, in those sleeping hours when the defenses are down, and the lyric that had gathered around it, that created an emotional experience with unusual staying power. It was a song that people returned to, in quiet moments and in collective ones, in grief and in aspiration, in the private interior of individual lives and in the vast shared spaces of public ceremony. And John Lennon, who had written it in a white room at 4 a.m. with a tape recorder and an open mind, could not have fully predicted any of that. He had only known, when he woke from the dream and pressed record in the dark, that whatever he had just heard was something he needed to hold on to, that it was, in some sense that exceeded his ability to explain, important. What the world made of the song after that point was beyond his control, as all songs, once released, belong to whoever finds truth in them. He understood this. He had by 1971 reached a kind of peace with the paradox of public expression, that you make something from the most private part of yourself, and then you hand it outward, and it becomes something else entirely, something that lives in other people's most private parts, and the two versions, yours and theirs, are both real, and neither cancels the other out. He was not always at peace with this. There were years when the distance between what he had meant and what was heard felt like a wound that didn't quite close. But there were also years, and moments within years, when the size of the connection, the sheer scope of the music reaching people in places he would never visit, in languages he didn't speak, across decades he would not live to see, felt like something that justified every difficult thing the creative life had asked of him. The tape recorder. Beside the bed, the dark room, the melody hummed in a whisper so as not to wake the person sleeping nearby, the fragile, contingent, almost accidental act of pressing record in time. These are not the grand gestures of legend. They are the ordinary materials of a life devoted to listening to the world, to other people, and to whatever it is in the mind that speaks most honestly when everything else has gone quiet. John Lennon was shot and killed on December 8, 1980, outside his home at the Dakota Building in New York City. He was 40 years old. In the days that followed, people gathered in Central Park, across the street from where he had lived, and they sang. They sang Imagine, the song that had arrived in a dream, the song he had hummed into a tape recorder in the dark so as not to lose it, the song that had come from somewhere he could never fully locate or name, that territory between sleeping and waking where the mind is most itself. They sang it without arrangement, without instrumentation, just voices, and the melody that melody held, it still holds. That is, perhaps, the most complete answer to the question of where great songs come from. Not from deliberate construction, not from technical mastery, not from the calculated application of craft, though all of those things matter, and John Lennon had all of them in abundance. But the ones that last, the ones that carry across generations and gather new meaning as they travel, the ones that people return to in their darkest moments and their most hopeful ones, those seem to arrive from somewhere else, from the dreaming mind, from the unguarded hour. From the part of a person that is most honest precisely because it is. Most undefended, John Lennon pressed record in the dark and caught something that was already passing through him. The rest, in every sense that matters, is music.